So today we're going to begin Unit 5, Slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction. In the book, this is about 6 chapters, but we'll try to get those through as quickly as we can. And Section 1 will be Slavery and the Road to the Civil War. Now, it's unlikely that you're going to get a DBQ or a major essay question on slavery on this AP test, only because they asked a question on it last year, and they also asked it in 2009. But there's still likely going to be several multiple-choice questions on slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction. So we'll still have to prepare through it, but we're not going to spend as much time on this unit as we have in the past, only because it's unlikely that you'll get an essay on it this year around. So, let's talk about slavery. Slavery's nickname is, or rather we called it the peculiar institution. What does peculiar mean? Weird, strange. So slavery was called the peculiar institution because it was weird. And the reason why it was weird was that while the rest of the world was eliminating slavery, what was America doing? The U.S. was increasing slavery. While England, France, Germany, all the other major developing countries were getting rid of slavery, America was actually increasing the amount of slaves that they had, which is kind of weird when you think about it. We're going against the trend. In fact, another reason why this is peculiar was that by 1860, only 3 countries in the world still had slaves. The U.S., Cuba, and Brazil. Now, nothing against Cuba and Brazil, but is this a list that America typically shares lists with? No, America typically shares lists with England and France and Germany and all these more powerful nations. But here we are on a list of what I would describe as developing countries, and we're on that list with them because only 3 countries in the world still have slavery. Cuba and Brazil are one of them, and we're just like them. And so is that kind of a bit backwards on our part? We shouldn't be on this list, and yet we are. Another reason why this slavery system is peculiar is because it's an immoral system in a democratic society. I mean, how does that work? For us to say, we believe in democracy for all except for them. But no, everyone should have democracy. Everyone should have democracy except for these people. I mean, how do we reconcile that? And yet somehow we do. Oh yeah, democracy is great except for these few exceptions. But everyone should have the right to vote except for them. And yet somehow we're allowed to have this immoral system in a democratic society, which is kind of backwards. And the last reason why this was peculiar is that many people argued that the slave system was against the principles of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, what did the Declaration of Independence say? It didn't say get rid of the slave trade, but it did say, in the preamble, in the very beginning, it said that it is self-evident that all men are created equal. And so they said, how could you have a government where your founding document says all men are created equal and that you don't believe that at all? Well, really, when you think about it, did the founding fathers really mean all men? No, they meant white men. They weren't counting slaves because slaves to them aren't men. Slaves were property. But they said, how can you believe that if all men are endowed with their Creator by certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, how can you have slavery? That makes no sense. And yet, this is the system that we had in America. It was weird. It didn't make sense, and yet it was there. Make sense to everyone so far? Okay. So let's talk briefly about the history of slavery. The history of slavery in the U.S. thus far was that slavery began in 1619 in Virginia, right in Jamestown. And in 1619, we brought over slaves from West Africa, as you guys know. And what was the economic reason for slaves? What could we do with slaves that made them so profitable in the long term? Huh? We can make them work on the farm, sure, but that's not what made them so profitable. It's not cheap labor because they're kind of expensive. It's not the 3/5 compromise either. Economically, what is it about owning slaves that make them so profitable in the long term? They can have kids. And once they have kids, who gets to own those kids? Slave owners. And so the economic reason why we kept slavery in America at the time was that with regard to economics, slaves could replenish. Or we got to keep kids. We got to keep their children as slaves, folks. And so is that a pretty good reason to have slavery? I mean, you buy two, you're solid. Or you don't even have to buy two. I buy a male, you have someone else in another town that buys a female, you force them to sleep together, and then you split the kids. Right? All of a sudden, you have more slaves than you started with. And so, economically, it made a lot of sense for a lot of Southerners. Yes, ma'am?
Was the girl, even when they were pregnant, they made them still work?
They would make them work less. Because, again, that's an investment now, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't want that baby to die because that's a lot of money there. And so what it came down to is if you were pregnant, depending on what kind of plantation you're on, and we'll talk about different kinds of plantations later, if you were a field hand at first and then you got pregnant, they might have you work in the house because you were less likely to have a miscarriage there. Also, you're less likely to be violent because you're taking care of your kid. So they figured you're a little bit more trustworthy. In any case, that's the economic reason. What's the political reason to have slaves then? If the economic reason was, hey, slaves are profitable in the long term, we don't have to pay for them, we can have their kids. Politically, why did we want slaves? Huh? Now that's still economic. Here, folks, why did we want slaves? Let me put it differently. Who did we not want anymore? Indentured servants. What was Bacon's rebellion, folks? It was an indentured servant rebellion. Servants demanding more rights. And so what it came down to was that we did not want indentured servants, or we were concerned about indentured servant rebellions. Like which rebellion? Bacon's rebellion. So we were concerned about indentured servants rebellions, so we decided, hey, let's just stop importing indentured servants. Let's replace them with who? Slaves. Because do slaves rebel? Not really. They do, but not very often. And we can pay them less. We'll make more money in the long term. They won't demand their rights because they don't know that they have any. So the expectation was, hey, economically, slaves will make us money. Think about how many slaves we can have in like 10 years if we buy just two. And even more so, Bacon's rebellion. These indentured servants are dangerous. Do you really want to keep these ruthless poor whites around? Or would you rather replace them with docile and tame slaves that don't rebel and don't demand their rights? I want the slave. And so ultimately, for the economic and political reason, we begin to replace the slave. Does that make sense to everyone so far? That's kind of what's going on there. 1 second. Hello? Hi. Wonderful, thank you. So, this is the major reason why the colonists, way back when, wanted slavery. Profitable, less likely to rebel. Good with everyone so far? Okay. Also, slavery is a big part of the African slave trade, and this African slave trade, where America is going to benefit from this. Yeah, we were going to make tons of money. So the African slave trade was very profitable for us as well, because we could make money selling the slaves, we could make money shipping the slaves. So the African slave trade for America also proved to be very, very profitable. So we definitely promoted that idea. Well, all the colonies at one point or another had slaves. Okay? It's not very common in the North, but early on, all the colonies had slaves. Now, did some colonies have more slaves than others? Most definitely. Which region had the most slaves? The South. And in the North, did they have a lot of slaves? No, very few slaves in the North. By the time of the U.S. Constitution, the northern states banned slavery. When they became new states, once they rebelled from England and they formed a new government, the northern states, when they wrote their new constitutions, they banned slavery. But did they try them out for a time? In the colonial era, they tried slaves. They tried them out. But ultimately, slaves did not last in the North. And why not? Why didn't slaves really work in the North, whereas they worked really well in the South? The Puritan work ethic. We have to work on our own. We have to make sure that we do our own works. And geographically, what else was different? That's a good religious reason, economic reason. But geographically, why was the North different from the South? Yeah, the soil wasn't very good, so we didn't have a lot of what in the North? Not a lot of farms, not a lot of plantations anyway. And so if we have farms, they're small farms. So is that easy enough for me to work? But do we have big plantations? Not very many. So you don't need slaves coming into the North. But the South did. So very different types of economies resulted in the South having slaves and keeping them, and very different religious reasons. The North believing in that Puritan work ethic where we work hard and we do our job, whereas in the South, hey, I'll let a slave work for me. You know, in the South, are we more aristocratic? In the North, we're a lot more democratic. Okay, so it makes sense so far in terms of slavery in the colonies? We had them for a while, eventually got rid of them when we became America. Yes? An aristocrat is like a wealthy landowner. Okay, think of like a king, like think of medieval times, like a landowner who owns all this land. Aristocrat is really like a wealthy landowner. Whereas in the North, we really don't have that because you have all these small landowners. But in the South, I'm pretty much an aristocrat because I'm this kind of this wealthy landowner that owns all this land and owns all these people. The North doesn't have that. We're a lot more democratic. The South, we're a lot more aristocratic. Very much like medieval times in the South. Whereas in the North, not so much. Let's talk about slavery and cotton. So again, this is cotton.
Isn't there like an old Disney movie called like the
Aristocats. That is a movie about cats. And it's kind of racist, that movie. There's Siamese cats that are supposed to be Chinese, and it's awful. It's not good. Anyway, slavery and cotton in the South. So, in the 1790s, slavery was not profitable. I mean, slaves cost so much, and yet were they able to make that much cotton? No, they were making so little because, yeah, they could pick it, but what was the hard part after you picked the cotton? Taking out the seeds. It was taking so long. They could only make 1 to 3 pounds per hour. It just wasn't efficient, and many slave owners said, this is not worth it. I paid like $400 for this guy, and I'm only making a couple dollars here and there. It's really not worth keeping this slave. Yes?
Didn't they invent the cotton gin already?
We're getting to that. But you're right about that. And so they were going to go ahead and end slavery. So one guy was like, oh, they're going to end slavery? We should make that faster. I'm going to hasten the end of slavery. I'm going to make it, slave owners, I'm going to make it so easy you won't need any slaves anymore. And so he created what? The cotton gin. So Eli Whitney creates the cotton gin. Eli Whitney created the cotton gin. And the idea was to end slavery. That we were not going to need slaves anymore because, masters, you could go out and pick the cotton yourself, and you can turn this wheel. It would be so easy. You'd make tons of cotton in hours. Like, oh, really? I could do that? Would it be just as easy if I hired 2 slaves? Like, I guess. I guess you could do that too. And would I make enough money to pay for both those slaves? Oh, yeah, definitely. Oh, well, then I guess I'm not ending my slave trade. And so ultimately, the cotton gin turned cotton farms into cotton plantations. And again, what's the difference between a farm and a plantation? It's large plantation, like huge plantation. Think like maybe this classroom, like the 30 building, the 2-story building, that's like a farm. And then like the city of La Puente is like a plantation. Big difference. Yeah, huge, very big. So you have these plantations versus these farms. And all of a sudden they become very, very profitable thanks to Eli Whitney. In fact, here's what happened to slavery, folks. 1790, yes, there were pockets of slavery. You see these red parts here? There were some pockets of slavery here, but for the most part, was there really that much slavery in the South yet? But with the invention of the cotton gin in 1790, here's what happened. By 1830, slavery spread that far, and by 1860, slavery spread all the way to Texas and a little bit in Utah. All because of the cotton gin. Good so far? The cotton gin spread quite dramatically. So much so that eventually, this region in the middle, there was so much cotton and slavery that this region became known as the Cotton Belt. Because this was a region where they what? They grew cotton. Just like if you have a technology belt, that's the region where they have a lot of technology, right? Or if they have if there's like a street here where they just sell like a whole bunch of tacos, that's like the taco belt. Make sense? In any case, folks, the increase in slavery was pretty large. By 1790, I'm going to simplify these numbers a little bit for you. But by 1790, there were 700,000 slaves in America. I'm going to round for you guys. But by 1790, there were 700,000 slaves in America, and a slave cost $400 a piece. By 1820, there were 1.5 million slaves in America. By 1850, there were 3.6 million slaves in America. And by 1860, there were 4.5 million slaves in America. And a slave was now worth $1,800. A lot. Not only did the number of slaves increase, but what happened to their value? It also increased. Now, someone asked me last period, well, Mr. King, if there's more slaves, shouldn't the price drop? That would be true, but the problem is the demand for slaves also increased. And because the demand for slaves increased, the price went up. I mean, if you're looking at supply and demand graphs, here's demand, here's supply. Supply went up. Why am I doing this wrong? That's right. If supply increases, sure, prices should be lower, but because demand also increased, all of a sudden, prices are higher. So that's just how supply works, supply and demand. You'll learn that next year. But in any case, the price for slaves went up, as did their numbers in America, all thanks to who? Eli Whitney. Thanks, sir. So, the demand for southern cotton increases. Just so you know, folks, the demand for southern cotton was actually quite large. 1/4 of all U.S. exports was cotton, southern cotton, which means does the U.S. economy rely heavily on cotton? Very much so. 1/4 of our economy relies on southern cotton. We need that cotton. The other thing you should be aware of is that the North needed Southern cotton too. The North needed Southern cotton. And why did the North need Southern cotton? What did we in the North need the cotton for? Huh?
Clothing.
Clothes. We needed the Southern cotton for our textile factories. Because without cotton, could we make clothes? No. And so if we needed cotton, that meant what else did we need? Slavery. We may not have wanted it, but did we need it? Like, we desperately needed cotton. Otherwise, what would happen to our northern factories? They'd go out of business. We'd lose all those jobs. We as northerners would have no clothes left. And the only way to get the amount of cotton that we needed was with slavery. So we needed Southern cotton. So by fact, did we also need Southern slavery? We didn't like that fact, but it was a fact. We needed Southern slavery. England also needed Southern cotton. Which means England also needed what? Southern slavery. In fact, England's economy, 75% of all cotton going to England came from the South. So 75% of all the cotton in England was Southern cotton, which meant that England's economy relied heavily on Southern economy. Did they need Southern slavery? So the North may have complained about slavery, but the reality is, did they need that cotton? They needed it. And unfortunately, there was nothing we can do about it. So you may not like it, but it's there, so deal with it, is the expectation. So that was the reality that they were living. That despite not liking it, they were stuck with it. And so the South said, you see, you need us, and you need our slaves. You can complain about slavery all you want, but do I have to worry about my slavery ever being eliminated? Do I have to worry about them trying to eliminate my slaves? No, because they need my slaves. You guys can talk all you want about how you want to eliminate it, but you need me to have slaves. Because if I don't have slaves, how are you all going to get your precious cotton? And so the South said, you know what? It's pretty clear. Cotton is king. And that's what they said. Cotton is king. And in the South, cotton was king. And so they called the South the Cotton Kingdom. Because what made the South popular with everyone? Their cotton. What did the North and England need from the South? Cotton. So did cotton dominate a lot of these economies? Cotton was the source of wealth. Cotton was a source of revenue. Cotton was a source of trade. Cotton was what everyone needed, what everyone wore, and there was no way you were going to have it without slavery. So do I have to worry about my way of life? Do I have to worry about you trying to take away my slaves? You hate it, but you're not going to do anything about it. I mean, think about it today, folks. Let me turn the mirror on you guys for a second. You guys like cheap stuff, right? I mean, would you guys be willing to buy a $50 shirt? No, you would rather that shirt be what? $3? $10? You'd be happy if you could buy a shirt for $3, right? If you could, you'd buy a $3 shirt. But think about it this way, folks. If you buy a $50 shirt, that means someone who made that shirt might be able to make, what, $15, $20 for making that shirt? You buy a $3 shirt, someone's going to have to get paid significantly less. Maybe 10 cents. But you want that shirt. And in today's economy, the cheaper that you guys demand things to be, which you do all the time, the cheaper or the less someone's going to get paid to make the things that you want. You guys want cheap shoes? Fine. We're not going to be able to make the cheap shoes that you want in America. So we're going to go ahead and outsource that to Pakistan, where a child that's 3 years old or 4 years old is going to be taught how to sew your shoes together because they were sold into child slavery. Those soccer balls and sports equipment you guys use, guess who makes those? Child labor. Child slaves. Today. Not 100 years ago. Today. A child will get paid a nickel for every soccer ball they sew together. because you want to make sure your soccer ball only costs what? $10? But if you're willing to pay maybe $50, maybe that child would get paid more. But that's not what you want. You say, slavery's not okay, but I'm not willing to end it if it means I have to pay more. It's true. I mean, do you guys ever question where your things come from? You ever think about the cost of the things that you buy? It's cheap for a reason. Because someone was paid very little to make the thing that you just bought. Think about that. Do you condone slavery? Maybe you do. I know you don't want to. But by suggesting that, well, I didn't know, Mr. King, now you do. And if you're going to choose to continue not knowing anymore, then that's your choice. But you can't say that you didn't know anymore. Now the responsibility is on you to do something about it. Why am I telling you these things? Because I don't want you guys to be ignorant. I want you guys to understand that everything that you do affects others. You know, if you shop at a store that's willing to sell you a t-shirt for $1, well, there's a reason why that shirt's $1. Does Walmart use child labor? Walmart does not choose child labor, but many of the things that you buy outsource to companies that use child labor. Like Walmart. Where do I get my stuff from? Different places. To make sure that I try to avoid child labor as best I can. Do the research. Yes, ma'am. If you buy something expensive, does that mean they get paid more? Not necessarily. Because sometimes people are just spending all the money on advertising or people are just greedy. But one thing to think about is that when you look at the things that you buy, go ask individual companies. A company, for example, like Crochet Kids, when you buy one of their beanies, the person who made it actually physically signs the beanie that you made, and then you know that even though that beanie costs like $20, you know that woman who made it is getting that money, and not like getting like 10 cents of it. So there are companies out there that focus on making sure the clothing that they sell and items that they make are made sustainable, and they're made to make sure that the people that make it are getting a fair share. Like the things that you buy from larger companies, they spend maybe the cost that you pay for something, 80% of it is advertising. And only very little goes actually to the people that make it. Yep. Now you're awake. Now you know. So if you decide to continue doing the things that you do, that's your choice. Now you're aware. But in any case, cotton is now king. So did they have to worry about a threat to their way of life? Absolutely not. Because they weren't going to have to change anything. The West is making food, like on their own. They're not using slaves yet. Now, because cotton was king, the South specialized in cotton. Because if we're going to make money on this, might as well focus on this only. And because they specialized in cotton, what didn't they do in the South? Remember how the three regions specialized? They didn't plant food, and they didn't what? They didn't industrialize or produce manufacturing. So no industrialization in the South. So because they specialized in cotton, they did not industrialize in the South. There's no industrialization in the South. And this is going to become important during the Civil War. Why? What is the North going to be able to make that the South isn't during the war? Guns, trains, tracks, clothes, those interchangeable parts. And was that going to be a major reason why the North wins the war? Oh, most definitely. But the South became so reliant on cotton, they didn't even bother to industrialize. And so this became a problem because the South thought that they were invincible. No one can touch us because we have a shield of what? Cotton. Which is weird, I know, but the shield of cotton will protect us from any harm. Because the English and the Americans wouldn't dare touch our slaves when we had the shield of cotton in front of us. Good? Cool? Cotton is king. Know it. Let's talk about Southern society then. What made up Southern society? You don't have to make this chart. Just do it in order that I am. At the top is the upper class. And the upper class consists of plantation owners. Now you assume that in the South, when you think about plantations at this time, you assume like everyone has a plantation, right? But that's not the case at all. In fact, in the South, these plantation owners who owned like 50 plus slaves, those mega plantations that you guys think about when you think of slavery, that was only 1,733 families. I know that sounds like a lot, but it's really not, considering the South had like 7 million people. And only 1,700 people had slaves, or like these large plantations. That's not very much when you actually think about it. The vast majority of the South was not mega plantations. Below them were the middle class, who owned some slaves. These were the small farm slave owners. These were the small farm slave owners. Most of these small farm slave owners, folks, they had about 10 slaves or less. That was about 255,000 families. They had about 10 slaves or less. They were just able to afford a few slaves. So, those small slave owners. And these people were considered to have achieved the American dream. Like, they did it. They got it. They got those slaves. But below them were the poor whites. These were the poor whites that had no slaves. No slaves at all. And instead, these were not cotton farmers. What kind of farmers were they? Subsistence farmers. Why can't subsistence farmers grow cotton? Because what can't your family do with cotton? You can't eat it. Like, yeah, I might be able to grow some cotton, but will that be enough to buy food? Maybe not. Whereas with corn, I can eat corn. So they mostly grew corn, not cotton. And this was 6.1 million Southerners. So we talk about, oh, there were tons of slave owners in the South. No, there weren't. The vast majority of those living in the South owned no slaves. No slaves at all. 6.1 million owned no slaves. The nicknames for this group were hillbillies. What's another common nickname for them? Rednecks. And what's another common nickname for them? Crackers. Or clay eaters. Clay eaters. Because they didn't have very much food, and so they would eat like crackers, looked like clay shots, and so they would just say that, oh, you guys are clay eaters, like you're poor. That's what you eat. Yes?
Why nowadays, like, they make hillbillies on TV look like they're racist and stuff?
It's a media choice. They want to market themselves, and they decide that's the way we want to look. It's a media's choice of how they want to decide how to portray themselves. I don't know. Why people think that they can make money, or why people actually give them money if they portray themselves as racist whites, I don't understand. You could be a cool white person and not be racist. You can also be a hillbilly and not be racist. There are lots of non-racist hillbillies. You know, just society's just weird. Yes?
There are some plantation owners that actually treated their slaves well.
Were there some plantation owners that treated their slaves well? Maybe. If you're a plantation owner, it's very unlikely that you treated your slaves well. If you're a small landowner, more likely that you treat your slave well. We'll talk about why in a second. But these poor whites, even though they didn't own slaves, they still wanted slaves. They wanted slaves still because they thought slaves were part of the American dream. They saw slaves as being part of the American dream, folks. I mean, if you think about it, you know the American dream, right? You know, have your own house, green grass, white picket fence, a slave. You know that story that people always talk about? But that was the American dream in the South. You had all of that plus a slave. And so they said, yeah, I might be poor and I might not own a slave today, but I want a slave in the future. And they said, well, you know what? I do want slaves, because hopefully one day I'll get one for myself. Below poor whites were then who? Free blacks. You had free blacks below the whites. The South had about 250,000 free blacks. And they were hated by Southerners. Why? Because they were free. And the problem is, if you're a slave and you see this free black walking around, what are you going to think?
He's a runaway slave.
Not a runaway slave, but if you're a slave and you see a free black walking around, what are you going to think?
That could have used my person to work.
Yeah, I want to be a slave too. I want to be free. What did I just say? I want to be free too. And so these slaves began to think to themselves, well, I want to be free. So a lot of Southerners, white Southerners, did not like the idea of free blacks because it encouraged rebellion for many blacks. So there are 250,000 Southern free blacks, but in the North there were also 250,000 free blacks in the North. There are 250,000 free blacks in the North as well. Just putting this on the side right now, but I'm just going to add this here. There were 250,000 free blacks in the North, and would you assume that they would get treated better in the North? They didn't. They were treated sometimes worse in the North. And the reason why they were treated worse in the North was, one, just racism. In the South, are we at least used to blacks? Yeah. We're all over the place. Yeah, we're racist, but, in the North, we're even more racist. And two, job competition. Free blacks means free blacks taking my jobs. And so they were not welcome in the North. They sure as hell weren't welcome in the South. Throughout the country, they were not allowed to vote. So it didn't matter where you lived. No black had the right to vote. Very few blacks were allowed to be taught how to read or write. Still, no rights whatsoever. But at least they were free, so is that still better than being a slave? But were their lives still terrible? Definitely. Again, like I said, they were considered second-class citizens. They were not given the right to vote. They were very much second-class citizens. Below free blacks then were who? Slaves. Slaves had no rights. They were considered property. That's the way it was. To put the numbers in perspective, folks, when you think about how many Southerners actually owned slaves, only 25% of Southerners owned slaves. Or only 1/4 of Southerners actually owned slaves. We assume that everyone in the South must have had a slave, but no. When you really look at the numbers, and if you were alive in the South at this time, you would notice that only 25% of Southerners actually owned slaves. Most Americans in the South could not afford a slave because most Americans in the South were what? Poor. It was only the middle class and the wealthy that could afford slaves. And only the very few that could afford these mega plantations of slaves. So again, different than what you expected, I know. Well, and again, when we're talking about slaves, very few actually owned a lot of slaves. Most families only owned 1 to 4 slaves. About a quarter owned 5 to 9 slaves. And those that owned those mega plantations, very, very few. So again, when you think of large plantations, few and far between. Let's talk about what cotton plantation slavery was like. So now we're on a plantation. Now we got there. Slaves were a major investment for slave owners because by 1860, the slave owners had invested over $2 billion in slaves. Slave owners had invested over $2 billion on slaves. Which means, are slave owners just going to be willing just to give up their slaves right away? No, there's no way they're going to give up their slaves because are they going to get the $2 billion back? No, somebody say, free your slaves, William Lloyd Garrison said. No! Are you going to give me back my $2 billion? So, no. they were very unlikely to give up their slaves. But slaves were considered a form of wealth. Slaves were considered a status symbol. Like, what's considered a status symbol today? You have like a really nice what?
Car.
A really nice car, for example. Right? Have a really nice car today, it's considered a status symbol. So one thing to think about is back then, let's say I invited you over for tea. I'm like, oh, so Giovanni, would you like some tea? I'm like, of course I would, Mr. King. And so I say, oh, Jeffrey. And so my slave walks in and Giovanni says, Mr. King, you have a slave? You must have done very well for yourself this last year. I'm like, well, we've tried. We've done pretty well for ourselves. Would you like sugar with your tea? I'm like, oh, of course I would. Stephen. And so my other slave goes, Mr. King, is that 2 slaves? I'm like, I do have 2 slaves. We've done pretty well for ourselves this last year. And so having multiple slaves was considered a sign of wealth. Like, oh my gosh, 2 slaves? Wow. You guys are doing really well for yourselves. Where the same is true today, right? You buy like a really nice Mercedes-Benz. Did your families buy Mercedes-Benz? That's crazy. You bought 2 Mercedes-Benz? That is crazy. You guys are doing really well for yourself this year. So that was that status symbol that I'm talking about. They were considered wealthy. If you had 1 slave, 2 slaves, whatever. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that because slaves were very expensive, very valuable, slaves did a lot of hard labor. Slaves performed a lot of hard labor. Long hours, difficult, strenuous, boring, menial, hard labor. But slaves did not do dangerous labor. Why would we not want our slaves to do dangerous labor? Because they might die. And if my slave dies, what happens to my investment? My $1,800, what happens to it? Poof, gone. So let's say I need to replace the roof on my house. Am I going to put my $1,800 slave on the roof of my house? No, because what might happen? They might not kill themselves, but they might fall off and die by accident. Am I willing to risk that $1,800? No. So instead, I'm not going to have my slave do the dangerous work. Instead, I'm going to hire poor Irish workers for $1 a day. So I'm going to hire a poor Irish man to fix my roof because it's dangerous. Because if he dies, how much do I lose? $1. Oh man, you died? Here's $1 for your family. I promised you $1. Good luck with that. But that was the expectation. Instead of me putting my $1,200 or $1,800 slave on the roof, I'm going to hire poor white guys to do it. So our slaves, who we treated like crap, were so valuable that we did not dare kill them. We could, but were we that stupid? Now, if I was like crazy rich, would I do that?
Yeah.
If I had like millions of dollars, sure. But for most slave owners, they'd be so pissed if their slave died. So what they would do is they would hire poor Irish workers. Like, hey, you're poor. You want to fix my roof? Oh, sure. And you fix my roof. You die, like, oh, you're dead. Here's $1 to your family. Yes.
Like the slaves were like sick or like ill, would they come to the doctors or like?
If the slaves were ill or sick, they would have the doctors come to them in this time. But yeah, they would take care of them because they wanted to make sure that that slave came back to health because it was cheaper to heal that slave than to buy a whole new one. Now, if that slave had like smallpox, it was going to spread to everyone else. You just killed that slave because it might spread the disease. But otherwise, most definitely, you tried to save your slaves. If your car breaks down, do you just like throw into the river? No, you fix that car because you spent so much on it. So, as inhumane as it is, you really have to think about slaves as they did, as tools. Slaves were tools to them. So what they did was if it was broken, you fixed it because it didn't make sense buying a new one. Okay? Question? Sure. And so this is kind of what they did. They also branded slaves. So if they ever ran away, would we be able to identify whose they belonged to? So if you were my slave, what I would do is I would take a hot branding iron, I'd put a crown on it probably, and then I would melt it right into your flesh. So that way, if you ever ran away, is that my slave? I don't know. You should have a crown on them. They'd look, if there's a crown, you'd be my slave. So every slave owner typically had a unique logo for themselves, and then they'd put it on the slave. And they would take that. So imagine take searing hot metal and just press it against your skin. And that's what it will happen to you. A few seconds. It's not just no, they sear it into you. Because if it's just right on the surface, your skin will eventually, shed, it'll go away. But they sear it into you, right deep into the endodermis. Oh yeah, that's forevers. Endodermis? You guys study biology? Your skin, and then the multiple layers of your skin. Okay. The other horrible thing that happened was slave auctions. Slave auctions were considered to be one of the most horrible things in the slavery system, because in slave auctions, you were oftentimes separated from your family. That would be the last time you would see your family. Because if you were a slave owner, say, okay, I'm here to sell this man, this woman, and their 2 kids. So what do I give for the entire lot? I'd sell all of them. Or if you want, I can break it up as a package. If you want 2 kids to work in your home, I can sell these 2 kids separately. I can sell the man for field work, and the woman's great for breeding. So if you want to buy the woman to have more slaves, you can do that too. And I would sell, let's say, the man to one person, sell the woman to a slave breeder, sell the children to someone else, and then they would never see each other ever again. That would be the last that they saw of each other ever. So many families were separated on a slave auction. It was considered to be horribly demeaning. On these slave auction blocks, they would sell cattle, horses, and slaves in the same auction, suggesting, again, what is the impression of slaves? They're just like animals, cattle. They're just like property. Many of these slaves were chained when they were brought up, but they were chained and they were completely naked, and they had oil and oil rubbed all over them to make them shine their muscles. But the idea was that they were stripped completely naked, which was very humiliating. But they're stripped naked so they could see if there was any what? Defects, but more importantly, they were looking for whip marks. Because if a slave had a lot of whip marks, what did that suggest? It meant that they were a slave that constantly disobeyed. So I want to sell you because you are a slave that disobeys. So I bring you up to the slave auction. And then everyone sees how many whip marks are on your back. Are people going to want to buy you? No. So I'm angry that I couldn't sell you. So what am I going to do? I'm going to beat you some more. I may not kill you because I still want to sell you, but I'm going to continue to beat the crap out of you because you did not get what I wanted. That's kind of what happened. We talked about that woman that was sold from her family. Many women were then sold to slave breeders. If you were a woman, this is probably the worst place you could go. Because on breeding plantations, that's exactly what happened. They would breed them like cattle or dogs. What they would do is they would buy women on slave auctions, and they would force them to have sex. If the women refused, they would rape them. If the men refused, they would threaten to kill the men. In any case, women either willingly or unwillingly were forced to have sex, and when they got pregnant, they were forced to bring the baby to term, care for the child, and then be forced to give them up. Can you imagine? One, you're getting raped repeatedly for several years, and then, when you finally have a child to make you forget all that, they're going to rip your child away from you. Most of these slave women that were sent to breeding plantations, they were expected to have upwards of 10 children.
How old were they?
Huh?
How old were they?
Pretty much by the time you could have children. So for some girls, that was as young as 12 and 13. Others, it was a little bit older. It just depended. Depends on pretty much when girls have their first period. But again, once you've bled, they know that, oh, you are a woman now and we can have children with you.
What about the men or the boys?
The boys, same. Puberty happens for men at about the same time. But typically, the men that you're going to breed with, you want them to be strong men. So you're unlikely to have little young boys do it. You want to know that you're a strong man. They're going to want stronger men to do it because the expectation is you want stronger babies for the plantations. In any case, for some of these women then, if they had about 10 or more children, if you were lucky, very, very lucky, you might be given freedom. on the very rarest of occasions. They might set you free because you made that master a lot of money. In some cases, if you're a little lucky, they might let you work in the house because you made them so much money. You worked in the house now. Is that going to be easier than working in the fields? Much. But if you were most slaves, once I was done with you and you really had nothing left to provide me, I would sell you back into the slave auctions, and you likely would get field work after that. So pretty much just like a tool, when I was done with you, I'd cast you aside, sell you to someone else, and instead of having a nice life because you just gave literally all of yourself, you would now go back and work on the field. So not an ideal life for women at all. Questions there? Nope. Okay. So that's kind of what's happening on slave plantations and slave breeding. One other thing you should note is that the mulatto population did increase significantly at this time. What are mulattoes? Mixed, half black, half white. So the mulatto population did increase at this time because you have a lot of white masters sleeping with their black slaves. That is happening at this time. Whether through rape or consensual sex, this is something that happened during this time period. So the mulatto population does increase at this time. Okay. So in order to control these slaves, we begin to pass what are known as the slave codes. The slave codes are designed, again, to control our slaves. To control the slaves. Really, the purpose is to control slaves. So here are the following laws that we passed in order to control slaves. Number 1, no weapons. Why not? Why don't we just want the slaves to have weapons? Because they might rebel. Makes sense. Also, slaves had curfews. Why aren't they allowed out at night? They might run away. There's a fear that slaves might run away, so they had a curfew. Number 3, they can't meet in groups. Except when? Work or when else? When else might we allow them to meet? Not when we eat, but when they go to church. Well, why don't we want them to meet in groups? Yeah, they might plan to rebel. So again, this is a serious fear for most slave owners, is this fear of rebellion. You can't educate slaves. You were not allowed to educate slaves. It was against the law to educate slaves. Why don't we want slaves to be able to read or write? They might read abolitionist books. They might read abolitionist newspapers. They might learn about democracy. Do we want them to do those things? Absolutely not. So slaves may not be taught to read or write. That is against the law. They also can't get married, so no marriage for slaves. I mean, they could, get married together, but was it a legal marriage? No, in our eyes, maybe it was legal. We saw them get married, and we know they're together now. But legally, there was no such thing as marriage for slaves, because slaves were considered what? Property. Slaves are property. Can your TV and your car get married? No, it was the same idea. So jumping the broom are some examples of African traditions that solidified that relationship within the slave community. But it wasn't something that was legally recognized by law. Does that make sense? Within our slave community, yes, we knew you were married. But legally, that meant nothing. Also, slaves could own no property. And again, why can't slaves own property? Because they're what? They're property. Does the TV own the remote? No. Does the horse own the saddle? No. Again, as offensive as that might sound, That's how the South believed them to be. Your property. You own nothing. What I give you is just a tool for another tool. You own nothing. Also, killing a slave was not a crime. Now, let me rephrase that. Killing your slave was not a crime. Am I allowed to kill someone else's slave? No. But killing your slave was not a crime. Because, folks, would I get in trouble if I took my computer out to the backyard and beat it with a tennis ball bat? No, it's my computer. It's my property. And so if I took my slave down to the courtyard and shot him in the head, would I get in trouble for that? No. I might get in trouble for discharging a firearm, but I wouldn't get in trouble for killing my slave because that's my slave. And are slaves human beings? No, they're property. And so the law said, there's no crime here. You did nothing wrong. You are allowed to, just like I could kill my own horse, I could kill my own slave. Yes. Yeah. So that's kind of the argument being made here. Lastly, there was the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule. And the one-drop rule said, if you had one drop of black blood, what did that mean? You were a slave. If you had one drop of black blood, you were a slave. So if your great-great-great-grandfather was black, you're a slave. You were considered African. So the one-drop rule. The last two obvious elements of the slave codes were one, slaves were property, and their children were property. And that's the two most important elements of the slave codes. So, one example of these slave code laws is, again, punishment for teaching slaves or free persons of color to read. If any slave, Negro, or free person of color, or any white person shall teach any other slave, Negro, or free person of color to read or write either written or printed characters, the said freeman, or the said free person of color or slave, shall be punished by fine and whipping, or fine of whipping, or fine or whipping, at the discretion of the court. So if you teach a slave to read, what happens? You're going to get whipped, and you're going to get fined. Or fined and whipped. But again, are they pretty serious about this stuff? So again, if you were a white person, would you even risk teaching a slave to read? No. Why would I risk my own life for you? Yeah, I mean, it's sad that you can't read, but I'm not going to risk myself so that you can learn how to read. And so these were the laws that were instituted to control the slaves. Let's talk about slave conditions, though. Anyway, slave conditions. So most children, most young children, especially if you were born on a breeding plantation, most children were raised by what were known as mammies. These were black female slaves that raised both black children and white children. They're like nannies, but they called them mammies. And they raised both white children and black children. So as the white children grew up, they would be raised by mammies. They would be breastfed by these black women, as would the black children, the black slaves, the children's slaves. They would also be raised by these mammies. Excuse me. Now, the reason why this happened for black children is that some laws said that children could not be auctioned until the age of 10. So some children, or some laws said that children could not be auctioned until they were 10 years old, because they said under 10 is too young. You want to auction kids when they're 10 years old. That's a good age to auction children off. You know what's a good age to auction children off, though? Never. Never is a good age to auction children. You should never auction children.
They were going to actually say an age. I was like,
Like 12. 12's a pretty solid. No. Never should you auction children. It's terrible. But they said 10 years old was a good age because under 10 was too young. But after 10, they might be learned enough to be able to be a good house slave, whatever else. Yes.
You know how you said that after they have children, they're the owners of property?
Uh-huh.
Would they like put a sign, some symbol on it?
Would they brand the children also?
At a young age?
It depended. Most likely, yes, they would brand children at a young age. The problem, though, is that if you resold your slave, you have this brand on them. So at a young age, you likely didn't brand them because you didn't know if you wanted to keep them yet or not. And most young slaves, you have them to sell them. And then you would like trade them for like an older slave. Usually how that worked. Okay, the branding, right? Yeah. In any case, life on plantations was different depending on what kind of plantation you lived on. On a large plantation, there were pros and cons. So on a plantation, there were some positives and negatives. The negative to living on a big plantation was that you were more likely beaten because there were tons of you. And if there are a lot of slaves, is one slave that's beaten going to really affect my production of cotton? No, I can beat you to almost an inch of your life. And that's okay for me because if I have 30, 40 slaves, should I beat one routinely just to be an example for everyone else? Like, hey, if you act up, you're going to end up like him. And is that going to make sure that the rest of you be normal and not rebel? So for me, if I was on a big plantation, I would be fearful because I'm more likely to get beaten because there's 40 slaves here. Any one of us could get beaten. And that was kind of a problem. The benefit to a big plantation, though, was that there was a community. You weren't alone. You got to share in this horrible experience, but at least you shared it with each other. So there was a benefit to the plantation system because at least you weren't alone. There was a community. You could get married maybe. You could get adopted by someone else, some other family. You weren't alone. Yes?
Why don't the slaves beat them up?
Why don't the slaves beat them up?
Yeah.
Fear of guns. A lot of slaves are chained together. It's just really difficult to do that.
They'll be like, you're gonna die.
Well, some slaves believed that this was better for them. They've been raised to believe that this was a good system for them. It really just depended. We'll talk about violent rebellions in a second, but some did rebel because they said this is terrible. There were minor rebellions, whatever else. But again, if you're chained and what if someone tells on you, you say, all right, guys, let's rebel today. And then you're the only one. Right? So it's that fear of trust also. And again, living is still better than dying for most things. Unless you're being horribly tortured. Yeah, their lives were terrible, but at least they, at the end of the day, they would still be able to hang out with their friends and, sleep with their children and wives and whatever else. So, on small farms, though, it was a bit different. The plus side of living on a small farm is that you were less beaten. Because on a small farm, how many slaves do you think they had? 5, 2, 1 maybe? And so if the farmer beats you, is he going to be able to use you to farm? No. And on those small farms, folks, the farmer that bought you is probably working right beside you, picking that cotton, working that farm. Whereas on the big farms, am I as a slave owner going to be working with you guys? No, but on a small farm, I only had enough money to buy that one slave. So it's very likely that I need the help. So yes, I'm going to be working with you side by side. And might we get close? We might actually become friends a little bit. Slave owner-master relationship, sure. But we're going to get to know each other because we're working side by side. The negative part about living on a small farm, though, is the loneliness. Sure, your master's a nice guy, but does he see you as an equal? You're still not equal. You still don't eat at their table. You still sleep outside on your own. So there's no equality there. So yes, you get beaten less, but life is still hard. Life is still not easy. There's no one to share it with. And so life is difficult, regardless. So let's talk about the responses to slavery. Let's talk about slave resistance and the nonviolent ones. Nonviolent resistance to slavery. So nonviolent resistance to slavery. One thing that many slaves did in order to resist because they couldn't really do much, was they decided to work slowly. They decided to work slower. They said, if I can't rebel, then I'm going to make sure you make very little money. So I'm going to work half as fast as I should. Now you might think, well, Mr. King, wouldn't they just get beaten because they're working slowly? Sure, but if we all work slowly together, then no one will know that we're just trying to be lazy. It might just be that we're just slow. And so, because they worked so slowly, a perception began that black slaves were lazy. And unfortunately, in society today, for many Southern whites, this perception has still remained even after slavery, that blacks are lazy. It's a common stereotype. And so, this kind of worked against them after slavery, but at the time it was a form of resistance. This was known as the Sambo image, that blacks were just slow and lazy. Another form of nonviolent resistance was they stole food and supplies. They're like, fine, you're not going to feed me a lot today, I'm going to steal your pumpkin pie. And you won't have any dessert for Thanksgiving. But it was small things. It made them feel happy. It was small slights, but it was something that they could do to fight back. One other example, they would sabotage equipment. What does it mean to sabotage equipment? They would break things. By the way, do you guys know where the word sabotage comes from? We talked about this, the word sabo. Sabo and sabotage. The word sabotage is actually a Dutch word. And a sabo, or sabotage, is actually a wooden shoe. So what happened was that Dutch peasants that were mad at their landowners would go into like the windmills, take their wooden shoe, and put it in the machine, and those cogs would break that shoe and the wheels and the cogs, and the windmill would stop working. And so what sabotage literally means is using your wooden shoe to break a windmill. But, because we're not Dutch anymore, the word sabotage just means to break equipment, but it was a common practice for Dutch peasants to use their wooden shoes to break machines. You learned something today, in addition to everything else. Sabotage. So when you're going to wooden shoe something, it's sabotaging it. Sometimes, but rarely, they would also poison their masters. That happened rarely, but it happens. They would poison their masters. And one of the most common ways for slaves to resist nonviolently was to what? To run away. One of the most common ways, though, for slaves to resist was to run away. So poison, and then running away. A more secretive way for slaves to resist, though, was through slave songs. Because slave songs were oftentimes coded messages. So here's one really good example. Follow the drinking gourd. Oops. Okay, here's the follow the drinking gourd. So listen to the lyrics first, we'll talk about what it's about.
The sun goes back in the first whale call. Follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. River bank makes a mighty fine road. The dead trees will show you the way. And it's left foot, right foot, traveling on. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd.
So, the Follow the Drinking Gourd song. The song is not just some slave song that he just sang in the field. I mean, one, it was a good song because it kept pace so that if you were working, everyone could work at the same rhythm and no one would look like they were working slowly than everyone else. But Follow the Drinking Gourd is not just some song that they sang. It's not about a drinking gourd either. What is the song actually about?
Way to escape.
It's a way to escape the north. Because what's a drinking gourd? Does anyone know what a gourd is or a drinking gourd? A gourd is a spoon with a cup at the end of it. That way, if you were going to drink water, you would drink it out of this. Like if there's a bucket of water, you would take a drinking gourd, pick it up, and drink it. But this drinking gourd, they're not singing about a spoon, folks. What are they singing about? They're singing about the Big Dipper. And the Big Dipper looks like a drinking gourd, and the Big Dipper always points in which direction? North. And so what they're saying is, follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is awaiting for you to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd. If you look up at night and follow that drinking gourd, you're going to be able to go north and you'll be free. So they say when the sun comes back and the first quail calls. When does the sun come back and the first quail call? Spring. So leave during springtime. That's when you know to leave. For the old man is awaiting for to carry you to freedom. When the riverbed makes a mighty fine road and the dead trees show you the way. So you need to find that riverbank with dead trees along the side. That's how you know that you're going to be following this right path. And it's left foot, peg foot. So at the base of those trees, there's going to be a circle and a footprint. If you look for that circle and that footprint on the base of those trees, you know you're all going the right path towards the north. And then the river ends between those hills. So keep following that river. But when you go between those hills, don't worry because there's a river on the other side. Keep following that river until you reach the north. Because I thought I heard the angel say, follow the drinking gourd. And here's the key line. The stars in the heaven are going to show you the way. Follow the drinking gourd. It's a coded message to tell slaves how to find the Underground Railroad to escape north. And yet these slaves were singing it in front of their masters, and they had no idea that the song was about the Underground Railroad. But that's exactly what it was. So songs like this were these coded messages that slaves could sing to each other to kind of pass on the message. Follow the drinking gourd. Springtime. That's when we're going. So that's what they did. So these were examples of non-violent resistance. But did they also get violent? Yes. In terms of violent resistance, the first example is the Stono Rebellion in 1739. In 1739, you had the Stono Rebellion. In 1739. And this is a rebellion of 100 slaves that rebelled, and they killed over 20 people. They rebelled, demanding their freedom. They killed over 20 people, and they were eventually defeated by the South Carolina militia. They were defeated by the South Carolina militia. Now, if you're a slave owner, is this going to make you a bit nervous that these things are happening? Sure. The next slave rebellion you need to know, the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion. Now, this is a failed rebellion. This right here is a failed rebellion, and it didn't actually happen either. This is a failed rebellion that never actually happened. They got caught. In fact, they got told on by 2 runaway slaves. 2 slaves actually told on Denmark-Vesey because they loved their master so much. They were worried that their master would be killed, and so they told on Denmark-Vesey before the slave rebellion even happened, and Denmark-Vesey and 30 people were hung. So there are slaves that genuinely believe that slavery is a good thing. And so they told on Denmark-Vesey, And actually, the funny part is that with Denmark Vesey was another rebellion we'll not talk about, but Prosser's rebellion. Prosser was also a rebellion that was about to happen. He also got told on by two slaves, so he fled downriver, and then he was caught by other slaves because there was a reward for Prosser's arrest, and so they caught him to get the reward, and then they never got the reward. And then they were sent back to slavery as well. So, yeah. This is what's happening. The last slave rebellion you have to know is Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. This is a definite must-know, folks, because of all the rebellions, this is the one that likely will come up on your test. Whether it's my test or the AP test, the Nat Turner Rebellion is the one you should know. In Nat Turner's Rebellion, it was a free black preacher. He was a free black preacher that led a rebellion that killed over 60 women and children. His rebellion was eventually put down by the Virginia militia. 60 women and children. And his rebellion was eventually defeated by 60 women and children. Again, if you're a slave owner, are these rebellions something to be concerned about? At any time, your family could be at risk. But again, they were defeated by the Virginia militia after the rebellion.
So they killed 60 women.
They killed 60 women and children. White. This happened to be women and children at the time, where they were rebelling. Eventually, they were put down, hung, all that stuff. So the South, being concerned, decides to respond to these rebellions, decide to respond to this nonviolent resistance. So the Southern response to this nonviolent resistance, only a few slides left and we'll be done for this week. Number one, they passed the Fugitive Slave Law in 1793. Pretty much what the Fugitive Slave Law said is what? This is a federal law. So it's not just in the South. This applies to who? The North and the South and the West, really. But it's a federal law. And what did this law say? What were you required to do? You had to return runaway slaves. The North, or everyone, was required to return runaway slaves. By the way, who ignored this law? The North. It was ignored by the North. By the way, just so you guys know, if you were a runaway slave and you did get caught, when they returned you, what would they do? They wouldn't cut off your foot. They would whip you, but they would do something worse. They would go ahead and take a saw and cut your Achilles tendon. So right behind, because you wouldn't be able to run anymore. If they cut this piece right here, right behind your ankle here, if they cut your Achilles tendon, that's it for you. You'll never be able to run or walk again. So if you guys just feel that behind your leg there, they will cut that with a saw on both your legs, and you'll never run again. You'll barely walk after that. But are they going to kill you? No, because you can still work. Huh? They would still do manual labor. They'd just be slower than everyone else. But they would cut your Achilles tendon. Both.
Slaves ever tried killing themselves?
Many did commit suicide. Many did commit suicide. Many murdered their master's children and then committed suicide. It just really depends. Like, some of them killed their master's children as a rebellion. It's kind of just dependent. Something else that they did, they had stricter slave codes. They promoted stricter slave codes just to make sure they didn't rebel anymore. And two more laws. Number one, they passed the gag rule. The gag rule in 1836 said you couldn't discuss slavery. You couldn't discuss slavery in Congress. The South passed this law saying you couldn't discuss slavery in Congress. And the reason why they passed this law, folks, is because why don't they want the South to be able to discuss slavery in Congress? I mean, so why do they want the North? My apologies. Yeah, the North is trying to abolish slavery. So they said, you cannot discuss slavery in Congress. And the reason why this law was passed was to prevent the North from trying to abolish slavery. So again, the law, the gag rule said you couldn't discuss slavery. And the reason why they said this was that they want to make sure that the North couldn't abolish slavery. Make sense? The last thing is the post office rule, also 1836. And the post office rule said you could not mail abolitionist material. You could not mail abolitionist material. Why was the South concerned about that?
Because if it doesn't get mailed, somebody will find it.
If it gets mailed, someone will find it. Who might find it? Slaves might find it. And then they might try to rebel. So you could not mail abolitionist material. You could not mail abolitionist material anymore. Many people argue this took away their what? Freedom of speech and press. Like, I have every right to mail whatever I want. But they said it took away the freedom of speech and press. Cool? Okay. We'll talk about the rest of this next week, folks. Have a good day. See you later. Again, folks, make sure that you guys complete your study guide. That's due on Monday, and your key term.